Hello and welcome to another Dragon Plus live stream. The most exciting hour of live streaming, caveat, on Tuesdays between 2 and 3 on the D&D Twitch channel.
Way to rules lawyer that, Bart.
I want to make sure that it's accurate but still positive in a way. So for folks that might be tuning in for the first time, this is where we discuss content heading into each issue of Dragon Plus. Take a visual look at the design, the development, and the running of your D&D game content, but also have a chance to meet with Jeremy Crawford every other week to talk a little bit more about the ongoing design process, especially following the Happy Fun Hour, which does a lot of design concepting and ideation. We felt it was a good opportunity to follow that with sort of how the design process continues to work within the halls of D&D. Is that an accurate statement as well?
That is totally on target. and in fact, as I think I've mentioned before, when we're on here, I'm often right in between design meetings. So right after being on here, I'll be going into a meeting where we are going to be digging deep into monster stat blocks for a book we haven't even announced.
Oh, yes. So we're saving you from a meeting, so that's a good thing in a way. And for folks who might not be familiar with my guests, although of course many of you already are, Jeremy Crawford is the lead rules designer for Dungeons & Dragons, the lead designer of the Player's Handbook, and the game's managing editor. All true statements?
All true.
All true.
How does he do all those things?
No, if only I kept it written down. So before we jump into questions, and for the topic of this week's Dragon Plus, and I've been calling this the Design Plus hour when we have Jeremy on as well. For this week, we did want to very briefly touch upon, as you might expect, the Giant Soul Sorcerer was released yesterday for Unearthed Arcana. We will have a lot to discuss about the continuing design of that Unearthed Arcana material in this week, but more so in weeks to come. Last time we did collect a good number of questions from our viewers, and so we also wanted to make sure that we did have an opportunity to address those questions. So we've collected and compiled those, and we'll be going through quite a few of those initially this hour as well. Before we begin, I did want to say a quick thank you to everyone who tuned in to the Stream of Many Eyes, and for those who were participating in any capacity, whether you were watching or chatting or moderating. Thank you so much to our moderators who were in attendance as well, or for guests such as Jeremy, who actually made the trek down to Los Angeles.
And I spent a good portion of the weekend DMing, but rather than on camera, I was backstage getting to DM long-form games. So, the streams had those really fun 90-minute sessions. Well, backstage, I was doing 3 to 4 hour sessions with an amazing build-out with Dwarven Forge buildings and miniatures.
I was jealous.
It was a lot of fun.
I was talking to the Dungeon Masters, though, the 90-minute slots for some of the games. That's its own challenge. That is tight. And knowing that somebody is coming right after you and that you've got to wrap up what's going on in 90 minutes, that can be a challenge unto itself.
I'll be doing a little bit of that, I think, this weekend when I'm at Origins. Yes. Because at conventions, often there are, slots that are 90 minutes long or sometimes 120 minutes long. And especially if you're a talkative DM like me, it can be challenging to wrap things up when you see the clock ticking toward the end. It's like, oh, but I want to do a little more.
I had that on my list. So you are jumping from event to event. We had the Stream of Many Eyes in Los Angeles last weekend. You will be in Origins.
I'll be at Origins. I fly to Columbus tomorrow.
Okay.
I will actually be doing a Sage Advice live panel on Friday. So any of you who are watching, if you're going to be at Origins, please join me on Friday, and you can ask me D&D questions to your heart's content for 1 hour in person. Also, if you see me at Origins or really anywhere, game store, other convention, never hesitate to come up and say hi. I love talking to fellow D&D fans. I can't promise that I will always be able to answer the questions you have, but I love to try. And I'll also be on a panel on Saturday that will be about LGBT themes in role-playing games, and I will also be DMing. I will be whenever I go to a convention, I love being a drop-in DM. So if you're in the D&D area, if you're approaching a table and the DM looks like me, it's a good chance it is in fact me, or it's one of my doppelgangers whom I deployed into the D&D area.
We were just talking about that last hour at the Happy Fun Hour. There's time travel and clones and all sorts of fun things that Mike is developing just to cause rules, consternations, and future design challenges.
Yes, yes.
Yes, I was going to ask you the usual, what are you reading, watching, playing? Time travel, I was just as an aside, Shelley Mazzanoble's least favorite convention in film, as far as plot devices. It just throws it into a tizzy.
Got it.
What in the hell is going
You're
on?
right. So reading, watching, playing.
Anything with time travel?
Nothing with time travel. So watching, I saw the horror movie Hereditary over the weekend.
Ooh, is that good?
I enjoyed it.
I will not watch that. I cannot watch that.
Yeah, you can't do horror movies, but
I can't even get through the preview correctly without freaking out.
So it was up my alley. It was trippy. There is some stuff in it that is sort of a callback to old horror classics like Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist.
Never seen it.
It's produced by the same people who produced the horror movie The Witch, which I loved partly because, as anyone listening might know, I love hags, and The Witch, that film, has an amazing portrayal of a classic fairy tale hag.
Now that one I could walk myself through gingerly because it's not that scary as it is eerie, and not really jump scares. That's the real thing that I can't stand, is when the tension gets ratcheted and something's coming at you. I can't take that.
So the last not this past weekend, but the previous 2 weekends before that, I was playing D&D. This coming weekend I'll be playing D&D. So this past weekend, rather than playing D&D, I played a little bit of the video game Battle Chasers on Nintendo Switch.
All right.
Which it certainly has a lot of D&D influence. So it is
many video games do.
Yes, it's funny that even the video games I play usually are D&D adjacent.
Yes. Yeah. And reading, did we ask reading?
Reading, let's see. What am I on to now? I am reading now a 4-volume series on the development of the notion of evil in Western mythology, theology, and history. So it started in the ancient world with various gods of evil that appeared in different Mediterranean religions, how that then influenced the development of Christianity, notions of evil in Judaism. 4-volume series. I'm going to be reading that for a while. But I'm already on volume 2.
So light popcorn.
Yes.
Page turner.
Yeah, it's by a historian called Jeffrey Burton Russell. I think I got his name right.
Very cool. So yeah, I'll have to pick your brain a little later about Hereditary.
Yes.
In any case, let's jump into some of the questions that you had. Again, we do go through the chat logs from every episode, and we compiled a few that we wanted to address for everyone's interest. Graph PCs, I'm going to mangle every one of your names because I cannot pronounce it.
This is required, mangle the names.
What, going back to Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, what was your favorite chapter to work on?
It's a tie in that book. First, I mentioned the bestiary because I love working on monsters. Yes. And I already saw in the chat, if you ever see me, by the way, on here, glancing over here, what looks like I'm glancing at this copy of Xanathar's Guide to Everything, I'm actually glancing at Bart's laptop where I see the stream of questions. I saw someone ask, when are we going to have one of these sessions on monster design? And I think it's a great idea for us to do it because I love working on monsters. They are these wonderful standalone game design nuggets. They each tell a story if they're designed well. So I loved working on the bestiary. It was such a fun range of nasty critters, a lot of high CR ones, far more gross creatures than we had intended. I think I've mentioned on here that we got to the end, we're like, wow, a lot of these things are disgusting. But so tied for me was doing a lot of the writing for the elf chapter.
Yes.
I really loved fleshing out the elf mythology. And some people have wondered, why did we delve so much into like elf culture, dwarf culture, halfling culture in a book called Tome of Foes? Shouldn't it all be about things you fight?
Right.
Like chapter 1, the Blood War, is all about demons and devils, which player characters often are at war with. Whereas you get to the elf chapter, and there's a lot about the dark society of the drow that has been influenced by the evil god Lolth. But then there's also a lot about regular elves. Well, our thinking there is we wanted to make sure you understood both sides of the conflict, that we weren't just telling you about the evil side in the D&D multiverse, but also about the sides, and often it's not just one side, it's multiple sides, these various groups that oppose it, particularly because people are often playing the elves, the dwarves, the halflings, etc., who are the opponents of the drow, the dwergar, and so forth. So we wanted to let you really dig in deep to both sides of some of these conflicts, including the side that you might be a part of.
So it's providing tools to help build your character, but also for the dungeon master to build more story into the conflicts against those characters.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So that also then the DM would be inspired to maybe do some world building, have some new insights in how to create an elven culture. What's distinctive about elves versus dwarves versus Githzerai, etc. And really dig in also into the myths behind these peoples. Because ultimately, as a fantasy game, so much of it is about that mythical layer. And Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes is really, in many cases, about kind of the mythical side of the game, about digging into some of these stories that almost transform any of the particular, transcend any of the particular worlds within the D&D multiverse. There are details about the gods, about the origins of some of these peoples in that book that almost stand outside time. Like if you look at the Forgotten Realms or Greyhawk or Dragonlance or any of our other official settings, you might think, well, some of these details line up, but others don't. And we were very conscious about that fact because, again, we were writing, again, it's sort of in mythical time, right? Basically about a prehistory, about this mysterious period in the multiverse's history before all the worlds were formed. Because we've even toyed internally with the idea of maybe some of the worlds in the D&D multiverse are older than others. That some of the big stories that we're familiar with in some of the worlds take place in wildly different times in the multiverse's history. And so maybe someday we will unveil some of the things we've been exploring at that sort of macro level. It's admittedly something that is really fun for us as storytellers to play around with, but we also have to check ourselves that we don't get too carried away, because often what DMs really need and players need is just like, what are the details for going into this dungeon or going into this town or talking to this queen. But that said, those myths can really help DMs create these cosmic stories that really resonate with people and help them really dig into, why do we even tell stories about elves? Why do we care about dwarves? What in fantasy, why isn't everyone just a human? And so part of our goal is to dig into why has D&D been fascinated by these non-human peoples from the beginning, and then more broadly, why has fantasy storytelling for centuries been fascinated by these peoples who are often kind of metaphors for different aspects of the human psyche.
I imagine in a way, like campaign building is similar to fiction writing insofar as there's a lot of background detail that you might work up just for your own edification. But it should never necessarily get into the way of the story, but still useful to have so that you can tell the story that you want. So. I did want, speaking of which, Mordenkainen's Tome, we have got Xanathar's Guide to Everything in front of me just because I loved the goldfish and how it took part in the Stream of Many Eyes.
Yes.
But Mordenkainen's Tome is out now and doing quite well. So I did want to say a quick thank you to everyone who has picked up a copy of the book. Thank you so much for supporting Dungeons & Dragons, and thank you for making the purchase, considering the purchase of Mordenkainen. So. Speaking of things that we do, this is a frequently asked question, so let's ask it again frequently. Akamaya, how can I apply for a job at Wizards of the Coast?
I'd say keep an eye on our job pages on the Wizards website. If you see a job pop up that you are qualified for, go for it. If you're specifically looking to get work as an editor or a writer or an artist or a graphic designer on our books, then the best thing you can do is do that work as much as you can for another company, for yourself, by putting things on the DM's Guild.
Yes.
Just make sure you're practicing your craft, because one of the best ways, the best way really, to get good at what it is we do is to do it. And if you can't immediately find a job where you're getting paid to do it as a hobbyist, do it for DM's Guild, get used to getting feedback, and also get used to, as I've talked about before, evaluating your own work. Be a critic of what it is you're writing, what it is you're drawing, what it is you're laying out, so that you can hone your work. You can make it the best version that you can make it. Ask your friends to review what you've created. Really try to be as dispassionate as possible, always with your reader or your viewer or whoever your audience is, always with their enjoyment in mind, so that you always have it clear in your mind who you're doing this work for. You as a creator, you want to be happy as well, so make sure you're following your own bliss while also providing as much enjoyment to your audience as possible.
And I would reiterate that nowadays, perhaps more than any other time, certainly, there are those platforms where you can express your hobby in a more public forum,
right,
with eyeballs that include Wizards of the Coast on it. DM's Guild is a great example where you're able to create your work and put it out there for consideration. Twitch, I would say, is another platform to use. Are you running games? There's channels that we watch as viewers, or YouTube videos that we watch as viewers, and it's an opportunity for anyone to express themselves in the brand, to take part in the brand, even if it's not in official capacity, it's still within the brand family. So.
Yeah, and I would say too, if you're any kind of creator, don't get discouraged by initial failures. Rarely do things hit the target on the first go. I mean, we demonstrate that by the fact that we are constantly iterating with our design. Mm-hmm. You know, we will design something, we might throw out most of it, we'll try again, we'll try again, we'll try again. Yeah. The point is, keep at the work, keep at the work, keep at the work. The other thing is too, and this sometimes is a tough message for people to hear, having good ideas isn't good enough. What's going to get you forward in the work you want to do, and here I'll zero in on game design or game editing or being an artist, what's going to get you ahead is doing the hard work of the craft, of actually putting words to paper, actually putting brush to canvas, doing the thing, having a bunch of ideas that you haven't formed into a fashion that's digestible by somebody else, that they can then use and enjoy. It means you're not there yet. You haven't done the work, and so really it's about doing the work. Do it again. Do it a few more times. Iterate, revise, refine, and if you fall down, keep picking yourself back up. Get advice from other people, and try new approaches. If you find your approach isn't working, see if you can take a step to the side, and suddenly you might have a path forward. When before you thought there was a wall in front of you, if you just alter your approach a little bit, suddenly, whoop, I have a clear path. I could talk about this a lot.
No, I think there's one of the things I've learned in these discussions is definitely we could structure many a sort of curriculum out of our discussions. And one of them would be, hey, I'm interested in becoming a career professional. How do I go about that?
Yeah.
So maybe that's content that we'll formalize at some point and put together.
But I mean, ultimately, it can all be boiled down to make stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Ideas, no matter how clever they are not good enough. You've got to make stuff.
I enjoy fiction writing myself, and it's the same thing. I have great ideas for 50 books, but it doesn't matter until you get at least a draft out.
Right.
Then there's something. Okay, I hate it. Well, let's revise and revise.
Yes. And you might revise it into a work that you and your readers are happy with.
Right.
But you won't know until you actually have words on those pages.
Yes. And it can be a challenge, I will say. Modern life, families, jobs, it can be difficult to find that time to get the pen to paper and commit. But if you can carve out just a little bit of time consistently, it does add up. Day by day, week by week, it does add up, and then you have a project, you have a creation. Let's move on to Minotaurs and Centaurs that we discussed the last couple of weeks. There were quite a few questions that came out of it. Centaurs wearing boots and so on and so forth. Io Duff asks, can centaurs ride on brooms?
And I'm assuming here someone means a broom of flying.
A broom of flying.
Or something like it.
Or a hobby horse.
Right.
What does that look like?
So any question like this is always up to the DM at the end of the day. But luckily, we wrote some guidance on these sorts of questions in the Dungeon Master's Guide. So if you're wondering, not just about centaurs, but really any being in D&D who has anatomy unlike a human or another humanoid, and you're wondering, can they use or wear a particular magic item? If you go to the front of the magic item section in the Dungeon Master's Guide, there is a whole section on wearing magic items, and talks and gives guidelines on what sorts of creatures can wear what, and gives some suggestions for the DM to adjudicate it. I, as a DM, would say sure. I mean, a centaur has hands to hold on to the broom,
right.
and that the magic holding them underneath could hold their horsey half.
Yeah.
So I, as a DM, would see no impediment to a centaur riding around on a broom of flying.
Some things might look ridiculous, but they're magic items. They meld or shape, or they're usable from a game mechanic perspective in many cases.
And I never, as a DM, let ridiculous stop me, because often ridiculous, especially if it's something players really want, will bring a lot of smiles to the table, and also sometimes I'm impish in that especially if a player is being really insistent about something that is pretty absurd, my strategy is not to say no. My strategy is to say yes and lean in hard to the absurdity. I will often find in the next session, they never suggest it again. Because basically I'm like, you want to walk around with chocolate ice cream on your face? Here you go. Here's all the chocolate ice cream on your face.
I was going to ask, did you have an example of this that came up in your campaign?
So it almost never happens in my current home game.
Okay, because they've learned.
No, well,
be careful.
Honestly, I do it at conventions sometimes, so you might see me do it if you play at one of my tables. In my home game, my players are so on board for the horror mood, because we're now in year 2 of Gothic horror, and I, by the way, originally thought this campaign was going to be only 1 year long, but we just keep going. I didn't realize I had this much appetite for horror, but woo boy. So they are so on board for the mood that this kind of thing rarely comes up. But even then, they will often want to come up with something bonkers that the rules barely support. And my default, and this is something we talk a bit about in the Dungeon Master's Guide, my default is I say yes. or often what I'll say is not yes, but you can try. and for me, the DC might be absurdly high, but I will rarely just say no outright.
So one of the things that I tend to do, and this because it relates to another question, is if it's something that the players really want, however ridiculous it is, and many times that supersedes whatever goal I think I've set out for them to achieve. That's the thing that they really want.
Yeah.
Obino Ojigami had asked, what tips do you have for a DM dealing with new players who don't seem to be self-motivated to do anything but wander aimlessly? How can I guide without pushing or dragging the party around?
That's a great question, and that in many ways has to do with adventure design, another topic we could do a deep dive on in a future episode.
Yes, and we should.
Yeah. Oh, and again, to be clear to everybody, today we're going to do a lot of this sort of catching up on questions. We'll do some more deep dives in future episodes, but the questions started piling up, and we thought it would be good to...
You had a lot of questions. We wanted to make sure we addressed them at least one week. Unearthed Arcana just came out yesterday. We will be getting to Giant Soul in weeks to come, the Giant Soul Sorcerer.
So regarding motivating those players who really are having a hard time engaging, part of it is making sure in your adventure design that there's some hook for the players that appeals either to their characters' pasts, often appeals to their hearts, appeals to their sense of, basically their sense of good in the world. You know, often if you put someone in peril, that will often be enough of a motivation for the group to go to that person's aid. So it's why so many adventures start with hooks of, someone's in trouble, go help them. Hey, this person you really care about really wants you to go on this quest. Or hey, you know, we talked in our session 0 about how much your character loved her grandfather who vanished decades ago, and bam, session 1, I let you know there are rumors that your grandfather was seen, who has not been seen in many a year. Tales have now been told that he crossed the threshold into this ancient temple in the mountains. Several people followed him in, and then there was no sight of him. That will be enough for many players to go, all right, we're heading up to that mountain shrine. We're going to start investigating what happened to Grandpa.
Yes.
And so you want to just make it personal for them, for their characters, or make it crazy. You know, again, all right, this village is burning down, put out the fire. And then often you can just have things start rolling from there.
Session zeros are really helpful. I would reiterate that as well. We had a Dragon Plus article a couple issues back where it was Sam Weigelt and Chris Tulloch had cards they would pass around the table to get a sense of who the characters were. But it kind of makes me think of a Session Zero using some party games just to get a sense of who the players are. If you give them just some random scenarios about, hey, if you saw this, what would you do? Or which would you pick between these choices? Just to get a sense of where the players' motivations are. Because you know that's going to inform their characters, and just see, okay, this is a group that is very curious or is very cautious or will definitely help the person in danger, or is going to be, tends to be motivated by, okay, what can I get out of this? So yeah, there's a little pre-planning that you can do with just a quick conversation around the table.
And I would also say when you do that pre-planning, as a DM, you often only need to hook a few of the characters. Because often, if you hook a few of the characters in enough, they will serve as the force of gravity that pulls the rest of the players with them. So that then the players have the perception that the motivation for what's going on came from within the party and not from the dungeon master. So I often love to plant seeds, story seeds for particular characters, and then let those characters' players actually do the heavy lifting on pulling the story in particular directions.
So going back, hey, my relative, there's rumors about them being there. I'm going.
Right.
That's going to motivate the group at large in a lot of ways. And so now it's a sort of an internal consensus that they're going off.
How I often make sure that other people are going to want to be motivated is, again, I will often work in some kind of moral appeal, where you're going to be going to help people. Sometimes there might be the glimmer of wealth at the end of the road, because wealth is often a motivator for certain characters. I also, in session 0, especially for a campaign, a long campaign rather than a one-shot or something, I make sure there are deep connections among the characters, so that usually if one character gets pulled along, they're going to pull the characters who they're deeply connected to along with them. And so characters in my campaigns, a few of them usually end up having some kind of family relationship. Some of the characters are often from the same organization. You have other characters who might have been adventurers with each other years before. They might be old friends. I've had characters who were as close to each other as, brother and sister, or two brothers. Years ago, there was a campaign where one of the characters was the uncle who was raising his nephew. If you build those kinds of deep connections in, again, all you often have to do is just tug on one of the strings, and all the other strings come along for the ride.
And that's not to say there can't be multiple motivations either. I was just thinking, why are they going to Alderaan? Well, Obi-Wan wants to do the right thing. Luke wants to meet the princess, and Han is in it for the money.
Right.
But it's the same goal that they're trying to achieve.
But that's actually, I love that example, because the bit about the money for Han, that comes from Leia, if I remember correctly.
Yes. Don't worry, you'll be welcome.
Oh, no.
Well, because he's taking the job, because he needs to pay off Jabba.
It might have been Luke who said, I think it was Luke who said, "You'll be rich."
Yeah.
So,
right. Yeah.
So that's a great example, in a way, of the party members tugging on each other toward the goal.
Right. You're not going to do it because you want to meet the princess. I want to meet the princess, but I need you to come with me.
Right. That's right.
Really quickly, just because Mad Wolf 12, I know you asked this multiple times last stream, and I want to get you an answer. Same question about can centaurs ride brooms? Can Eric Kokra or other winged player characters wear cloaks?
So again, this goes right back to that section in the Dungeon Master's Guide where it talks about who or what can wear various magic items. Check out that section. It will answer most of your questions. And although really the rule can be boiled down to the DM decides, and that section gives a variety of guidelines. Yeah. Again, just so you know the spirit behind the writing of those rules, and I can tell you, since I was the one who finalized those rules, my spirit behind those rules is, whenever possible, let it happen. This is why we built in strict rules like the 3-item attunement and whatnot. That rule is really meant to be the control. And it's why, actually, in the Dungeon Master's Guide, when you look in the section on tweaking the rules of the game, we say, tweak away, but there are a few rules in the game you're better off leaving alone. One of them is concentration. One of them is the 3-item attunement, which, of course, then we fiddled around with in the version of the Artificer we did a while ago. Because again, we were very careful, and we knew, we knew the risks we were taking there.
Yeah.
But one of the reasons, again, why that strict rule is in place is so that if you use that rule, you can then otherwise feel comfortable saying yes. Because it's like, well, as long as you're not, busting out of your normal 3-item attunement, let them wear what they want to wear. And if the issue is, well, it might look ridiculous. If the player wants their character to look ridiculous, let them look ridiculous. Again, I think it's often funny how groups get really concerned about policing the appearance of other people's characters. And it's like, again, if I want my wizard to look the fool, let me do it.
Yeah.
But again, part of the fun of D&D is your choices can have consequences. If my character looks the fool and wanders into town, I will kind of enjoy it if the DM then makes there are consequences, makes it so that there are consequences where then the NPCs are noticing like, why does this guy look like a clown? You know?
Well, we're going to treat you like a clown.
Yeah.
I love the concept of the rules as sort of this instrument panel, and you can adjust the dials here and there, change the channel, change the volume. This one's vertical hold, so you might not want to screw that one too much, but still, it's this machine of Lum the Mad going on.
But you know what? Even there, let's say a DM decides, let people attune to 5 items, 6 items, 8 items.
Right.
The game is not going to disintegrate in your hands if you do that, but you are opening potentially the door to a lot of insane interactions between various magic items. And more importantly for us, you're opening the door to a potential complexity that could really slow your game down. And speed of play so that you can focus on the fun and on the story is almost always our goal with these things. But if a DM in the group is all for that, like, hey, we're all for having 8 items interacting with each other, and the DM is willing to accept the consequences of that and the potential adjudication headaches, that's on that dungeon master. And again, I'm not going to say DM, don't do it, because again, my rule of thumb is follow your bliss at your table, nudge D&D in the direction that works best for you and your players when you're the dungeon master, but also, just like I was saying about being a game designer, also as a DM, don't be afraid to iterate. Don't be afraid to admit, all right, maybe letting people have attuned to 8 items, that was kind of a huge shit show, pardon the term, and maybe we're gonna dial that back.
We're a mature channel.
Yes. So So also as DMs, it's okay to have that frank conversation with your players sometimes, just like we do about the game itself. Like, this thing didn't quite work out the way we intended, the way we desired. We're going to change course. We're going to adjust, because at the end of the day, it's not about, especially as dungeon masters, when you're DMing a group of players, it's not about being right. It's about having a great time. It's about you smiling. It's about your players smiling. It's about, at the end of the session, remembering all those awesome things that happened in your adventure. It's like, who cares if it turned out a ruling you made or a ruling that a player suggested turned out to be a bad idea? Because the beauty is you can change it. You can course correct. Yeah. You can have a frank conversation with your group and say, we're now going to go this way, and let's give it a try.
And if you are changing sort of the laws of physics of your campaign, perhaps find a logical conclusion to your current adventure path at the moment, just so you can get to the end of here are the way that we've been playing the rules, so that when you do restart, you're starting afresh, if not from a whole new campaign, at least from a whole new start to the adventure. And having open and frank conversations with your players, also always good advice.
Yeah.
A little bit of a rules question here. Avistinus asks, find steed indicates that you fight as a seamless unit, yet find greater steed says you control the mount in combat. Excuse me. Is this intentionally different per mounted combat rules?
So the wording in find steed and find greater steed, wait, where is the question? Can you point it to me so I'm looking at the text?
Yeah,
Thank you.
I bounced around a little bit.
The difference in wording is intentional. In fact, man, you followed this up great, because this is an example of me iterating. The original Find Steed, the way it's worded, this seamless fighting unit, spawned questions naturally on what does this mean for the mounted combat rules? Because in the mounted combat rules, we tell you when you hop on a regular mount, either it is an independent mount or you're controlling it. And it was unclear to people in the original spell what our intent was, whether this magical mount that the paladin conjures up gets to choose, or the paladin gets to choose whether it's independent or controlled, or whether we were suggesting it had to be controlled.
Right. You summoned your paladin horse, but he hates you. That's
right.
Nothing to do with you.
Right. So when I was working on Find Greater Steed, I decided, hey, here's a chance, because there's a new spell that very similar to this other one, for me to put in greater clarity and to show what's intended for this spell. Also, this is important for you to know, whether you're interpreting official rules material or writing rules material of your own, it's an exceptions-based game. You'll hear me say this a lot. I never tire of saying it because it is fundamental to understanding how to interpret the rules and also how to write them. And that is, when you get into something like a spell, we think of a spell as an exception. It's an exception to a general rule. The general rules in the game are things like the combat rules, the rules on skills, the general rules on spell casting. But as soon as you get into a particular class feature, a particular magic item, a particular feat, a particular spell, a particular monster, you are in the realm of exceptions. And each of those exceptions is almost in a way a universe unto itself. What it says inside, once you're inside that universe, what it says about itself applies only to itself. And it's okay if there are other spells that are even kind of similar that work in a different way, because this is really important, because again, this goes back to the theme of we want the game to be easy to play and as straightforward as possible. When you're reading a spell and playing that spell, you don't have to worry about what other spells say. All you have to care about is, what does this spell say?
Yeah.
But that means then, as a designer, you need to do as much as you can to make sure each of those rules exceptions you're creating can indeed stand on its own and answers the most important questions that your likely players are going to have. Now you might be wondering, how do we know what are the most important questions? This is where playtesting comes in. And playtesting can be actual play. It can also be, that can also be shorthand for get thousands of people to read it and give us feedback. And then also playtesting can be after the fact play, once something is published and we all just keep using it year after year. And so this fine steed versus fine greater steed difference is a great example of after the fact playtesting, of we all used it many, many times, and it became clear that other spell could have been clearer, and so we learned that lesson and made sure to apply that lesson when designing a new spell. And our hands weren't tied, because this is the other beauty of a specific thing always beating a general thing, is our hands aren't tied when we're doing later design. We don't have to keep repeating the mistakes. Like, there's no rule in D&D that says every spell must be exactly like the spells in terms of its formatting and wording as every spell that's come before it. No, if we have figured out a better way to do things, we're going to do it in newer spells. People will then ask, again, this is important for you to understand both as a user of the rules, but also as a potential designer of them. People will ask, well, does the newer thing then invalidate the older thing? Indeed, it does not. Because again, that's the beauty of an exceptions-based design, is each of those things can stand on its own, and nothing is taken away from the old thing by the new thing doing something differently. If you still like how the old thing works, the old thing is still fabulous. Basically, if it is still for you, to use one of my favorite words, if it's still juicy for you, enjoy it. And don't let anyone talk you out of it. Sometimes as gamers, we get so passionate, and we'll be so excited about one thing, it can be very tempting to try to talk somebody else out of their enjoyment. Please, please don't do that. Because the beauty of D&D is that we can each enjoy different things. That's a part of the game's design. Important for you to understand as a potential designer of the game, that when you're designing for like a person who loves wizards, you have different goals than you do if you're designing for a person who loves fighters, or a person who loves clerics, or a person who loves rogues. You want to make sure that you are appealing to all of this huge spectrum of enjoyments that people have having to do with different styles of play, different styles of storytelling. And so one person enjoying thing A takes nothing away from somebody else enjoying thing B. And in fact, D&D is designed so that a D&D party is strongest when you have a little bit of A and a little bit of B and a little bit of C and a little bit of D, and they are working together and playing off each other's strengths.
It is a challenge for the Dungeon Master, and I give all credit, as always, to Dungeon Masters out in the world for managing those play styles. They're varied, they can be different, they can come into conflict, they can come into great cooperation. But yes, kudos to the DMs of the world. A Cook A cook, 32. I'm guessing you're a cook and you're 32 years old. Asks, lead with a carrot instead of the stick. This was when we were talking about, I believe we were talking about Minotaurs and Centaurs and their ability score adjustments. Lead with a carrot instead of the stick. But why do the kobold and orc get penalties?
So we've gotten this question before. The orc and the kobold race options, which appear in Volo's Guide to Monsters. As we say in the introduction of the section where those monsters appear, they are exceptional. And here we go. Here's that theme of this is an exceptions-based game. That we knew that we were violating one of the principles that guides our design for a typical race option in D&D. But as we note in that book, we did that on purpose because in most settings, these are usually villainous options. And part of the story of D&D is goblinoids in particular and orcs have often tried to conquer the other peoples. They've often been tyrannical and whatnot. And we also wanted to show that there is potentially even a mechanical reason for why they ultimately keep losing. That said, we know that a penalty is not for everybody. And if it's a real sticking point in a particular group, a player could ask the DM if the penalty could be waived. Those penalties are a great example of mechanics largely serving a story purpose.
That's what I was going to ask.
Yes.
It doesn't sound like it's to disincentivize players from choosing these challenging race options so much as it is hitting the correct story beats for what feels right for the world.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Because as I mentioned when we talked a bit about the Centaur and the Minotaur, race design, more than almost anything else in the game, is us walking a tightrope between building satisfying player mechanics and world building. Because we're not just making statements about your character, we're making statements about D&D worlds and how these different groups have traditionally interacted with each other. But again, often in particular campaigns, the story is about defying those traditions.
Yeah.
So DM, if you're telling a story and let's say your dwarves in your home campaign setting don't even live underground, well, you might want to swap out dwarven stone cunning for something else and come up with a new racial trait to go into that spot.
You can always tweak the dials.
Yes.
You're able to tweak the dials.
Absolutely. And as with anything, if you do that kind of tweaking, just see how it plays out. If the group loves it, you've hit a home run. If it falls flat, again, this is the beauty of it, you can admit that it fell flat and you can iterate. And here's the other thing. Doing that as a dungeon master is a fantastic way to develop your chops as a potential D&D designer. All of us on staff who've been working on D&D for a decade or more started out really doing just that, tweaking things as DMs, trying them out again, and being willing to admit when something doesn't work. And that admission is often the first step toward getting you toward that awesome design where people are going to be like, oh, I just love it. That really brought this story to life, or this character to life, or really added just that special something to that monster that wouldn't have been there otherwise.
You reminded me of something I wanted to bring up a couple of questions ago, which is after the fact, we're going to need to go into Reddit at some point, because I'd love to start a thread asking the dungeon masters out there, have you set up campaigns or adventures where you have tweaked the dials way more than you might have been comfortable with, and what were the results? I'd love to hear some of the stories that have come out of that, playing around with the instrumentation.
Because each of us as dungeon masters, in a way, has way more liberty than I and the rest of the team have as the game's official designers. The reason why I say that is our job is to model the most typical thing in D&D. And if you want to design, that's a really important thing to keep in mind, that you are, if you're designing for broad consumption, you're designing, and broad consumption specifically in Dungeons and Dragons, you're designing for the most typical things typically. Unless, of course, the sort of what's on the tin tells you, here's this really atypical thing. That's also awesome. And we do that ourselves occasionally, as we did with the goblin and the orc. But as DMs, there's not often, when you're DMing your own setting, or even when you're using an official setting, because like if you're DMing in the Forgotten Realms in your home game, that's your Forgotten Realms.
Right.
Suddenly, you can do what you want. You can make the tweaks that feel right for your group.
You're designing for your table.
Exactly.
As opposed to as many tables as possible.
Yep. Yep.
We're almost at 3. We don't even we haven't even gotten through all of the questions that we compiled from last time, and we haven't even touched upon the giant soul sorcerer. We'll go a couple minutes after, if that's all right.
And then I have to run off to my monster design meeting.
So we will we'll wrap up here quickly with another question or two. I did want to jump ahead with just a couple of announcements. Again, next week, we will be talking to the folks at Idle Champions. And then the week after, we'll be returning with Jeremy to continue Design Plus discussion. So we will continue to address questions as they come up as much as possible.
Oh, man,
You've got one to highlight for this time or next time?
But if I answer it, we're never going to get to the giant soul.
Okay.
So I wanted to answer the question about advancing animal companions. So we'll do that next time.
Okay. So we'll continue to address your questions. We'll begin on the giant soul sorcerer next time as well. I did want to just quickly mention, as the Dragon Plus livestream, Dragon Plus issue 20 is available now for free on iOS, Android, and as always at dragonmag.com. We got some great content, including Stream of Many Eyes behind the scenes features. We've got some cartoons from Jason Thompson about the Yugoloths. And a piece from the Adventure Zone, a comic preview here. There'll be Gerblins and their playable adventure, I believe in full, Return to the Test of Initiation, based on one of their podcast episodes. Now they compiled that into a playable scenario. So if you're a fan of the Adventure Zone, look for that in this issue of Dragon Plus. Again, thanks to everyone who was participating in the Stream of Many Eyes, watching, chatting, able to take part. For folks that were there in Los Angeles, thank you so much for coming on down and taking part. And this weekend, again, we do have Origins coming up. So a live Sage Advice panel will be taking place on Friday.
Bring your questions. Anything D&D related. They don't even have to be rules.
D&D Beyond will be live streaming from Origins for all day on Friday. So we'll be hosting them as much as possible on the D&D channel as well.
I will even lurch onto that stage at some point.
So let's see. I think that's all the announcements that I wanted to give. We've got 4 minutes. Is there one question that we can address in 4 minutes? Or did you want to touch on the Giant Soul Sorcerer, and we can?
Yeah, I want to touch on the Giant Soul Sorcerer real quick.
Let's do that.
We can do some detailed discussion in our next one. One of the things I wanted to say about the Giant Soul Sorcerer in comparison to the Order Domain, because we started this series together talking about the Order Domain.
Yes.
And I mentioned that between the initial concepting that people got to see some of in Mike's Happy Fun Hour, and then Unearthed Arcana, we made a ton of changes.
Yes.
In fact, at least 75% of what was in Unearthed Arcana was different from what was original. That sometimes happens in the development process, where, as I talked about then, we throw out a whole lot and we iterate. And then based on the playtest feedback we'll get back, we'll iterate some more.
Right.
So in contrast, what I wanted to say is sometimes you'll get a concept that is sound enough, that has enough sort of good story meat that informed its rules design that a lot of the original concept makes it through the initial round of development and redesign. And that's true of the Giant Soul Sorcerer. A lot of what's here, people will recognize from the concept version that appeared in the Happy Fun Hour. A lot of what I did was refine rather than removing something and replacing it with new design. This was a case of, and this is almost always the case, by the way, if you have strong story concept, almost always, if you carry that through your game design is going to be better. If you start instead for D&D with, I just want to design these cool mechanics, oh boy, is that a crapshoot on whether you're going to end up with anything good. Like clever mechanics will almost never stick the landing as well as something that is actualizing a story in a resonant way. Because our game is a story game. It's that simple. That if people look at it and they're like, I can imagine this thing in a D&D world. I can imagine this person on an adventure. That as a designer is what you're going for. Not, oh my God, I've come up with the most clever way to move people around on the grid. And I say that self-critically because as many of us who have been working on D&D for many years, we have done the equivalent many times of, woo, I've come up with this clever way to move people around on the grid. And it turns out that is rarely as exciting to people as these rules make me think of an awesome character, an amazing event, a whole adventure I want to spring up out of this person's backstory or this monster's ecology, etc. So story first, story first, story first, and that's why the Giant Soul Sorcerer exited its concepting phase in really solid shape. Right away, I'll talk about, before we run out of time, the first feature, Jotun Resilience. This feature echoes the first feature that the Draconic Sorcerer has in the Player's Handbook, and you will notice those of you who are familiar not only with that feature in the Draconic Sorcerer, but also with the original concepted version of Jotun Resilience, there used to be a second piece to it. Right now, it increases your hit point maximum every time you gain a sorcerer level. But it used to also give you an additional benefit that allowed you to use your Constitution instead of your Dexterity as a part of your armor class calculations. I ended up cutting that second piece because the Giant Soul Sorcerer at first level was already strong enough without having that little extra bit, which ultimately would have led to a lot of confusion because as I looked at all of the different ways that Constitution could be, swapped in place of Dexterity throughout the game, it started bringing up more questions than the potential good that little bit in the feature could bring. And by the way, if you're ever wondering when you're looking at your own design, is there something I should cut? That's often a good test. Have you designed something that basically poses more questions than the fun that it's potentially going to deliver? Or another way of putting it is it more interesting than it is fun? Often my ears perk up and I go on alert if I hear a design being described solely as interesting. To me, it is far more important that a design be fun, that a design be inspiring, that there's something there where a person sees it and they're like, I get it, I know how to use it, and I understand how this fits into my character when we're talking about design that's player character focused. When it's instead, again, some variation of moving people around on the grid or, I've come up with this very mathed out way of delivering this mechanic, I guarantee you, most people who play this game, that will not resonate for them. You want to try to deliver your mechanic in as straightforward a way as possible where a person who's not an expert in every nuance of D&D rules can read it and get it. And also at the end of the day, the Giant Soul Sorcerer simply didn't need that little extra kicker because I look at everything at a particular level holistically. the Giant Soul Sorcerer is also getting extra spells at first level. And for the Sorcerer, who has a pretty constrained number of spells known, that's a saucy benefit to suddenly get that additional amount of flexibility. And as a Giant Soul Sorcerer, you pick which type of giant you're connected to, and bam, at first level, you know 2 extra spells. And also, something we did here that's similar to what we do in Cleric Domains, some of the spells in this little table are not normally sorcerer spells. So it also means you're gaining access to some spells that you would normally have to multi-class to get, or take a feat like Magic Initiate to get. But instead, here you get, and you'll see spells like Armor of Agathis or Heroism or Shillelagh that are not normally available to sorcerers. So you get these extras, and again, that's a juicy benefit. And hey, you get more at 3rd level, where you get some more powerful spells. So we're out of time. We'll talk more about the Giant Soul Sorcerer next time. But again, this subclass starts off strong at first level. Also, something that I always have in mind with first level subclass features, which not all classes have, because some classes have their subclass kick in at 2nd or 3rd level. First level subclass features can be dicey once we account for multi-classing. I have said before that we don't normally do our multi-classing pass until we've decided we're actually going to publish something. So I've not done a full multi-class analysis on this, although I have to admit I always do a little bit on my initial pass. And so that's also why I often try to keep first level subclass features tight and being just enough. Because if you go too overboard and you're at a table where they use multi-classing,
everyone wants a level of...
And there's nothing wrong with multi-classing, but I like multi-classing. I like the motivation to be usually story reasons, and not, I just want to cherry pick the best features from this constellation of classes.
To keep up with the Joneses, I have to have a level of this class because everyone has that. I'm also going to go with Jotun Resilience is a great name for a Giant Soul Sorcerer.
Yes.
Or a wrestler of some kind.
Yeah, I like it.
Speaking of the Stream of Many Eyes.
Yeah.
All right, well, we'll let Jeremy get to his next meeting where he's going to be designing monsters in an official behind-the-scenes capacity. But thank you, as always, for joining the live stream.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for watching.
As always, thank you so much to our viewers, to our followers, to our subscribers. Thank you so much. We'll be back with Jeremy in 2 weeks. We'll be back next week with Idle Champions. Again, we've got D&D news coming up shortly at 3:30. Dice Camera Action will be vodcasting from the Stream of Many Eyes, their episode there this week. And then I believe they'll be back the following. So stick around, and thank you, as always, for tuning in. The most exciting hour on Twitch, on this channel, 2 to 3 on Tuesdays. Thanks, everyone.